She whispered the question that changed everything. "If I sit any closer, will you finally say what you're thinking?" What he said next made her realize that sometimes the scariest thing isn't falling in love. It's admitting you already have. The office was almost empty now. Just the hum of computers and the distant sound of traffic outside the tall windows. She sat at her desk, pretending to focus on the spreadsheet in front of her. But really, she was aware of every little movement he made 3 feet away. 2 years. That's how long they'd been working together at this design firm. 2 years of sitting close enough to hear him tap his pen against the desk when he was thinking. 2 years of catching the scent of his coffee, always black with just a little sugar. 2 years of learning his habits, his patterns, the way he'd lean back in his chair and stare at the ceiling when he was stuck on a problem. At first, it was just normal coworker stuff. They'd talk about projects, share ideas, sometimes grab lunch with the rest of the team. He was good at his job, really good. She respected that. He had this way of looking at a problem from angles nobody else thought of. And he was kind, too. Not the fake kind of nice that some people put on at work. Actually kind. He'd stay late to help someone meet a deadline. He'd remember if you mentioned something important happening in your life and ask about it later. She didn't know exactly when things changed. There wasn't a specific moment she could point to. It was more like a slow realization, like watching the seasons change. One day you notice the trees are different, but you're not sure when it actually happened. Maybe it was 6 months ago, maybe longer. But somewhere along the way, her heart started doing this stupid thing whenever he walked into the room. She'd feel this little jump in her chest, this awareness. She started noticing things she shouldn't notice. The way his hair fell across his forehead when he leaned over his work. The rare smile that reached his eyes when something genuinely amused him. How his voice got softer when he was explaining something complicated, like he was letting you in on a secret. She told herself it was nothing, just a silly thing that would pass. She'd had crushes before. They always faded. Besides, there were so many reasons this was a terrible idea. They worked together. They were on the same team. Getting involved would be complicated and messy and probably end badly. She'd seen it happen to other people. The awkwardness after, the tension, having to see each other every single day when things fell apart. So she kept it to herself. Locked it away. Built a wall around those feelings and pretended they weren't there. But lately something had shifted in him too. She wasn't imagining it. She was almost sure she wasn't imagining it. It started about a month ago. He'd become different, quieter, more careful around her. Before, their conversations had been easy, natural. They'd joke around, tease each other, talk about random things. But now there was this strange politeness between them. Like they were strangers making small talk at a party. He'd still help her with work stuff, still be professional and friendly. But there was a distance that hadn't been there before, and sometimes she'd catch him looking at her, just for a second, when he thought she wasn't paying attention. There was something in those looks, something that made her heart race and her hands feel shaky. She'd glance up from her computer and he'd be staring. Then he'd quickly look away, clear his throat, pretend he'd been focused on something else the whole time. She'd started collecting these moments without meaning to, storing them away like little treasures. The time he brought her favorite tea when she mentioned having a headache. The way he always seemed to remember details about her life, things she'd mentioned weeks ago in passing. How he'd adjusted his schedule to be at the office during the hours she worked even though he didn't have to. It was Thursday evening now. Past 7. Most people had gone home hours ago. The cleaning staff had already made their rounds on the other floors. It was just the two of them, working on this big presentation that was due tomorrow morning. They'd volunteered to stay late and finish it together. At the time, it had seemed practical, efficient. Now, sitting in this quiet office with just the glow of their monitors and the city lights outside, it felt different. More intimate than it should. She could hear him breathing. That's how quiet it was. Could hear the soft clicks of his mouse, the occasional rustle of paper. The heating system kicked on, and she watched him pull his sleeves down slightly, always cold in the evenings. He'd been especially quiet tonight. Usually, even with the new distance between them, he'd make some conversation when they worked late. Comment on the project, ask about her weekend plans, something. Tonight, nothing. Just focused silence. She knew why. She'd seen the way he looked at her when she'd arrived today. Seen him take a deep breath, like he was preparing himself for something difficult. This wasn't just about the work. There was something else happening here, something building between them for months now, maybe longer. Her chair squeaked slightly as she shifted her weight. She'd been sitting in the same position for too long, her neck stiff, her back aching. She stretched, rolling her shoulders, and caught him glancing at her from the corner of his eye. He looked away immediately. The silence pressed down on her like a physical weight. All these things neither of them was saying, all these feelings carefully hidden and ignored. She was tired of it, so tired. Tired of pretending she didn't notice the tension. Tired of acting like everything was normal when it clearly wasn't. Tired of lying to herself about what she felt. What was the worst that could happen? He could say she was wrong, that she'd misread everything. It would be embarrassing, yes. Awkward, definitely. But at least she'd know. At least she wouldn't spend another 6 months wondering and analyzing every tiny interaction. Or he could say something back. Admit that this thing between them was real. And then, well, then they'd have to figure out what to do about it. She saved her work and closed the file. Then, making a decision before she could talk herself out of it, she rolled her chair closer to his desk. Just a few inches, then a few more. "Can I see what you're working on?" she asked softly. He nodded, not quite meeting her eyes. She moved closer still until their chairs were nearly touching, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Close enough to see the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers had stilled on the keyboard. She could feel her heart pounding. This was it, the moment where everything either changed or stayed exactly the same forever, where she either said something or let it pass and went back to the safe, careful distance they'd been maintaining. The words came out almost as a whisper, barely louder than a breath. She hadn't planned them, hadn't rehearsed. They just appeared, pulled from some brave part of her she didn't know existed. "If I sit any closer, will you finally say what you're thinking?" Time seemed to stop. The world narrowed down to just the two of them in this quiet office, with all the unsaid things finally demanding to be heard. She watched him, waiting, her heart racing so fast she thought he might actually hear it. His hand slowly lifted from the keyboard. He turned toward her, and for the first time in weeks there was no careful mask on his face. No polite distance, just raw, honest emotion. For what felt like forever, he didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Fear? Relief? Maybe both. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, that constant background noise you never notice until everything else goes quiet. Somewhere down the hall she could hear a door close, the building settling into its nighttime emptiness. Then he let out a long, slow breath, like he'd been holding it for weeks. "You want to know what I'm thinking?" His voice was rough, tired. He turned his chair to face her fully, and she saw it then. The exhaustion. Not physical tiredness, but the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. "I think about you all the time, and I hate that I do." The words landed between them like stones dropping into still water. She felt her breath catch. "I wake up thinking about whether you'll be in the office early or late," he continued, running a hand through his hair in that way he did when he was stressed. "I find excuses to walk past your desk. I remember stupid, little details about things you mention, things nobody should remember, your favorite type of pen, how you take your coffee, that you hate meetings before 10 because you're not a morning person." He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound, more like defeat. "I've been trying to stop. For weeks now I've been trying to just treat you like a coworker. Keep my distance. Be professional. And it's driving me crazy because nothing works. You're still the first person I want to talk to when something interesting happens. You're still the only person in this whole office who gets my sense of humor." She wanted to speak, to tell him she felt the same way, but the words stuck in her throat. She just watched him. This man she'd been secretly caring about for months, finally letting down all his walls. "I convinced myself it was impossible," he said quietly, looking down at his hands. "I've got so much going on. My life is complicated. 3 years ago my marriage fell apart, completely fell apart, and I have a daughter. She's 7. Sweet kid, but she's been through a lot already. Her mom and I share custody, and it's not always easy." He looked up at her then, and she saw something vulnerable in his eyes, something scared. "I can't just think about myself anymore, you know? Every decision I make affects her. And what if this doesn't work out? What if we try and it ruins everything? We work together. We'd still have to see each other every day. And I can't. I can't mess up her life more than it's already been messed up. The mention of his daughter made her chest tighten. She'd known he had a child. He kept a photo on his desk, a little girl with a gap-toothed smile. But hearing him talk about it made it real in a different way. This wasn't just about two people who liked each other. There were actual consequences, real responsibilities. And honestly, he gave another one of those tired laughs. I'm terrified of ruining what we already have, of not being good enough, of feeling this much about someone again. Last time I felt this way about someone, I married her. And look how that turned out. She finally found her voice. You think I'm not scared? He looked at her, really looked at her, waiting. I've been scared this whole time, she admitted, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite her racing heart. You think I haven't been doing the same thing? Trying to convince myself this is just a crush that'll go away? That I'm imagining things? She pulled her chair a little closer until their knees were almost touching. 3 years ago, I was in a relationship, thought it was serious, thought we were building something real. Then I found out he'd been seeing someone else for 6 months. 6 months of lying, of me being completely clueless. The memory still stung even now. After that, I promised myself I wouldn't do this again, wouldn't put myself out there, wouldn't trust someone enough to let them hurt me, and especially not someone I work with. That seemed like the worst possible idea. All the risk of a relationship plus the guaranteed awkwardness if it fails. So what changed? He asked softly. Nothing changed. That's the problem. She smiled but felt tears prickling at her eyes. I still think it's risky. I'm still scared. I still think this could go wrong in about 100 different ways, but I've been sitting here for months pretending I don't feel what I feel. And you know what? That's exhausting. Maybe even more exhausting than being scared. He reached out slowly, hesitantly, and took her hand. Just held it. His palm was warm, slightly rough. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, and also like something completely new. When did this happen for you? She asked. When did you realize? He thought for a moment. Remember that project in April? The one where we had to completely redesign everything at the last minute because the client changed their mind? She nodded. That had been a nightmare. 2 weeks of late nights and stress. We were here until midnight one night, he said. Everyone else had given up and gone home. But you stayed, and we ordered terrible Chinese food, and you made some joke about how, if we were going to suffer, at least the spring rolls were decent, and you had this sauce on your chin, and I almost reached over to wipe it off but stopped myself because that seemed too intimate. He smiled at the memory. You were tired and stressed, and your hair was a mess because you'd been running your hands through it all day, and I just thought, this is the person I want to be stuck here at midnight with. This is the person I want next to me when things get hard. And that scared me more than anything. For me, it was your daughter, she said quietly. He looked surprised. Not when I met her, she clarified quickly. I mean, I'd see you on Monday mornings and you'd tell stories about your weekend with her. How she's obsessed with dinosaurs and knows more facts about them than you do. How she insists on wearing this purple dinosaur shirt until it literally falls apart. The way your whole face lights up when you talk about her. She squeezed his hand. That's when I knew this wasn't just attraction, because I didn't just care about you. I cared about the things you cared about. I wanted to know this little person who was so important to you, and that's when I really got scared. They sat like that for a while, hands joined, just looking at each other. The proposal they were supposed to be working on sat forgotten on the screens behind them. So what do we do? He finally asked. Where do we go from here? I don't know, she admitted. I really don't. This is complicated, you're right about that. Your daughter, my trust issues, the fact that we work together. None of that magically goes away just because we finally admitted how we feel. But? He raised an eyebrow, hearing the unspoken word. But maybe complicated is okay. Maybe it doesn't have to be perfect or easy or make complete sense. Maybe we just try, carefully, honestly, and see what happens. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, a real smile this time, the kind that reached his eyes. Okay, let's try. Neither of them moved to let go of the other's hand. The office was completely silent now except for the hum of their computers and the distant sound of the city outside. They'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross, said things they couldn't unsay. And somehow that felt exactly right. The next 2 months were like living in 2 different worlds at the same time. At work, nothing had changed. At least that's what it looked like from the outside. They still sat at their desks, still worked on projects together, still had the same professional conversations they'd always had. But underneath, everything was different. Every casual interaction carried a new weight. Every accidental touch sent electricity through her. Every shared glance held a secret. They were careful. So careful. Nobody at the office could know, not yet. They hadn't even figured out what this was themselves. How could they explain it to other people? But outside the office, away from curious eyes and office gossip, they were building something. Something fragile and new and terrifying and wonderful all at once. They started meeting for coffee before work. Early morning meetings at a small cafe 3 blocks from the office, far enough away that they wouldn't run into coworkers. She learned that he was grumpy before his first cup of coffee, but sweet after. He learned that she liked to people watch and make up stories about strangers walking by. Lunch breaks became walks through the park near their building. They'd grab sandwiches and find a bench, talking about everything and nothing, their dreams, their fears, their childhoods, their favorite movies, all the little details that make up a person's life. Dinners stretched into hours at quiet restaurants on the other side of town. Places where the lighting was dim and the tables were tucked into corners and nobody from their firm would accidentally walk in. They'd talk until the servers started putting chairs up on tables, giving them polite hints that it was time to go. She felt like a teenager again, sneaking around, keeping secrets. It should have felt wrong, but somehow it felt like the most honest thing she'd done in years. Then came the Saturday that changed everything. He'd been nervous all week, she could tell. He kept starting to say something, then stopping. Finally, on Thursday, he'd just blurted it out over their morning coffee. "Would you want to meet my daughter? This weekend? We're going to the park. If you're free." No pressure. Her heart had jumped into her throat. This was big. This wasn't just about the 2 of them anymore. This was him saying she might be a real part of his life. This was him trusting her with the most important person in his world. She'd said yes before she could overthink it. Saturday morning, she changed her outfit 3 times. Too formal, too casual, trying too hard, not trying enough. She finally settled on jeans and a simple sweater, telling herself this was just a casual park visit, not a job interview, though it kind of felt like one. The little girl was shy at first, hiding behind her father's leg, peeking out with big, curious eyes. She had his smile, that same warmth that reached all the way up to her eyes. "Hi," she'd said softly. "I'm your dad's friend from work." The girl had studied her seriously for a long moment. "Do you like dinosaurs?" She'd crouched down to the girl's level. "I don't know much about them, but I'd love to learn." That had been the right answer. The little girl's face lit up, and suddenly she was pulling a plastic dinosaur from her pocket, launching into an explanation about the difference between herbivores and carnivores that was honestly impressive for a 7-year-old. They spent the afternoon at the park. She pushed the girl on the swings, careful not to push too high because she could see the worry in his eyes even though he was trying to hide it. They had a picnic on the grass. The little girl showed her every single dinosaur in her collection, explaining each one in detail. By the end of the day, the girl had taken her hand while they walked back to the parking lot. It was such a small gesture, but it made her chest feel tight. This child, who'd already lost one version of her family, was trusting her. That responsibility felt enormous. After he'd dropped his daughter off at her mother's house, they sat in his car for a while just talking. "She liked you," he said, and she could hear the relief in his voice. "I liked her too. She's amazing." "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being so good with her. For not treating her like she was in the way." "She's not in the way. She's part of you. How could she be in the way?" He'd kissed her then for the first time, soft and gentle and full of gratitude and hope. But things got complicated fast after that. It started small, a coworker making a comment about how they seemed to spend a lot of time together. "You two are always grabbing coffee." "What's up with that?" said with a laugh like a joke. But there was something in her eyes. A knowing look. Suspicion. Suddenly they felt like they were under a microscope. People were watching them. Or maybe they'd always been watching and now they were just aware of it. Then his ex-wife found out he was seeing someone. He hadn't told her directly, but his daughter had mentioned Dad's friend one too many times and she'd put it together. The phone calls became tense. The custody schedule became a battlefield. His ex started finding reasons why he couldn't take his daughter on his usual days, started making subtle threats about how the court might view him having a new relationship so soon. "It's been 3 years," he said, frustrated, after another difficult phone call. 3 years since we separated. When am I allowed to move on?" Her own family wasn't much better. Her mother, protective after watching her daughter's heart get broken before, had concerns. "He's divorced? With a child? That's a lot of baggage. Are you sure you know what you're getting into?" "He's not baggage, Mom, he's a person. And yes, his life is complicated. But whose isn't?" But her mother's words stuck with her. Was she ready for this? Really ready? It wasn't just dating someone. It was potentially becoming part of a child's life. Being involved in custody schedules and co-parenting drama and all the complexity that came with it. The pressure built. Small cracks started to appear in what they were building. They had their first real fight on a Wednesday evening. They'd stayed late to work on a project, and he'd mentioned that they should probably tell their boss about their relationship. He'd just been promoted to a senior position, and he was worried about how it would look if people found out they'd been keeping it secret. "Why do we have to tell anyone?" she'd argued. "It's our personal life. It's nobody's business. Because if someone else tells them first, it looks like we were hiding it for a bad reason. It looks unprofessional. And you don't think it'll look unprofessional either way? You're my senior now. People will say you're giving me special treatment. I would never do that. I know you wouldn't. But people will think it anyway." They'd gone back and forth, both getting more frustrated. It wasn't really about telling their boss. It was about all the pressure from every direction. The stress of keeping a secret. The worry about his daughter. The ex-wife drama. Her family's concerns. The co-workers' suspicious looks. It was all piling up. Finally, he'd said the words that made everything stop. "Maybe we need to take a break. Figure out if this is really worth all the complications." She'd felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. A break? Just to think. To really consider if we can handle all of this. She'd wanted to argue, to tell him they could figure it out together. But part of her was relieved. Part of her had been thinking the same thing and was too scared to say it. "Okay," she'd said quietly. A break. They'd gathered their things in silence and left the office separately. The drive home was the loneliest she'd felt in months. 3 weeks. That's how long the break lasted. 3 weeks that felt like 3 years. The worst part was seeing him every single day at work, walking past his desk, sitting in the same meetings, hearing his voice, catching his eye accidentally and then quickly looking away. It was torture, like having something precious right in front of you but not being allowed to touch it. They were polite, professional, exactly what they'd been before all of this started, except now it felt like playing a role in a play she didn't want to be in anymore. "Good morning. How was your weekend? Can you send me that file?" All the right words, none of the meaning. She threw herself into work, volunteered for a new project with a different team, anything to avoid sitting 3 feet away from him all day. Stayed late, came in early, filled every moment with tasks and deadlines and meetings so she wouldn't have time to think about the empty space where he used to be. But nights were harder. She'd lie in bed staring at her phone, fighting the urge to text him. She'd type messages and delete them. "I miss you." Delete. Was this a mistake? Delete. Can we talk? Delete. Her finger would hover over the send button, and then she'd close the app and put the phone across the room so she wouldn't be tempted. He wasn't doing much better. She could see it in the shadows under his eyes, the way he'd space out during meetings, the coffee cups that piled up on his desk. He looked tired, not just physically tired, but soul tired, the kind of exhausted that comes from fighting yourself. He took on extra hours she heard through office gossip, staying until 9, 10 at night, coming in on weekends, burying himself in work the same way she was. They were both running from the same thing, just in opposite directions. His daughter noticed something was wrong. He mentioned it once in passing to a coworker. She overheard it from 2 desks away, her ears picking up his voice even when she was trying not to listen. "She keeps asking about my friend," he'd said quietly. "Wants to know when we're going to the park again. I don't know what to tell her." That'd hurt worse than anything. The idea of that sweet little girl wondering where she'd gone. Why the nice lady didn't come around anymore. She hadn't just walked away from him. She'd walked away from his daughter too, and that child had already had enough people leave her life. She tried dating. Her friends meant well. They set her up with a guy from their gym, a nice enough person who worked in finance and had good manners and laughed at the right times. They went to dinner. He talked about his portfolio and his workout routine and asked polite questions about her job. She felt absolutely nothing. Just sat there nodding, smiling, counting the minutes until she could politely leave. The whole time she kept comparing him to someone else. He didn't make her laugh the way he did. Didn't understand her references. Didn't have that gentle way of really listening when she talked. Didn't make her heart do that stupid flutter thing. She went on one more date with someone else just to be sure. A friend of a friend who was supposedly perfect for her. He was fine. Perfectly nice. Perfectly boring. She made an excuse about an early meeting and went home before dessert. Meanwhile, he was doing his own version of the same thing. She saw him once by accident at a restaurant near her apartment. He was with a woman, someone she didn't recognize. They were sitting across from each other, and even from a distance she could tell it was a date. The woman was talking, animated, smiling. He was nodding, being polite, but his eyes were somewhere else. Distant. Lost. She'd left quickly before he could see her, but the image stayed with her for days. Him sitting there trying to move on, trying to force himself to feel something for someone else, failing just as badly as she was. What neither of them knew was that they were both doing work they should have done years ago. She went back to therapy. She'd stopped going after her last relationship ended, convinced she'd dealt with everything. But sitting in that familiar office again, she realized she hadn't dealt with anything. She'd just built walls. Thick, high walls designed to keep out pain, but they'd also kept out everything good. "You're afraid of being hurt," her therapist said gently. "That's natural. But you're so focused on protecting yourself that you're hurting yourself in a different way." "I don't want to be stupid again," she admitted. "I don't want to trust someone completely and then find out I was wrong. But you're not the same person you were 3 years ago, and he's not the person who hurt you. You're treating him like he's already betrayed you. But he hasn't. He's just someone who's scared. Just like you are." It took weeks of sessions, of really digging into her fears before she started to understand. She'd been so focused on what could go wrong that she hadn't let herself consider what might go right. She'd been waiting for him to disappoint her, to prove that her fears were justified. And in doing that, she'd pushed away exactly what she'd been wanting. He was doing his own work too. He had conversations with his daughter, real ones. Asked her how she'd feel about him seeing someone. Really seeing someone, not just casual dating, but someone who might become a regular part of their lives. Like the nice lady, his daughter had asked hopefully. Maybe like her, he'd said carefully. His daughter had thought about it seriously, the way kids do when you treat them like their opinions matter. I liked her. She listened to my dinosaur facts. And she didn't pretend to know things she didn't know. She just asked questions. What if it didn't work out? He'd asked. What if she became part of our lives and then things changed? His daughter had shrugged with the simple wisdom of a 7-year-old. But what if it did work out? Then we'd be happy, right? Out of the mouths of children. He also had to face something else. His marriage had failed, yes, but that didn't mean he was broken. Didn't mean he was incapable of having a healthy relationship. His ex-wife had been right for a time and then they'd grown apart. That was painful, but it wasn't a character flaw. It was just life. He'd been carrying around this idea that he was damaged goods, that anyone who got involved with him was taking on a burden. But that wasn't fair to himself, and it wasn't fair to anyone who might care about him. The moment everything shifted happened on a random Tuesday. Their firm won a major contract. A huge project that had been in the works for months. The project that she and he had worked on together, back before everything got complicated. Back when they were still just co-workers who stayed late and ordered bad Chinese food and laughed about spring rolls. There was a celebration at the office. Champagne in plastic cups, people congratulating each other, music playing from someone's phone. She stood in the corner nursing her drink, watching him across the room. He was talking to their boss, shaking hands, smiling. But even from here, she could tell the smile didn't reach his eyes. Their eyes met across the crowded office. Just for a second. But in that second, she saw everything. The loneliness. The regret. The same ache she'd been carrying around for 3 weeks. He excused himself and headed for the door. She watched him go, counted to 30, then followed. She found him outside, leaning against the building, staring up at the night sky. The city lights made it hard to see stars, but he was looking anyway. "Hey," she said softly. He turned, and the look on his face nearly broke her heart. Hope and fear mixed together. "Hey." They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. 3 weeks of silence between them. 3 weeks of trying to move on and failing. 3 weeks of learning things about themselves they'd needed to learn. "This break didn't change anything," she finally said. "Did it?" He shook his head slowly. "Made it worse, actually. At least before, I could pretend that maybe it was just attraction. Maybe it would fade. Now I know it won't. I went on 2 dates," she admitted. "I went on 1. Feel anything?" "Nothing. You?" "Less than nothing." They both laughed, sad and relieved at the same time. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said. "A lot of therapy, actually. Working on my trust issues. My fear of being hurt. And I realized something. I was so scared of you hurting me that I hurt both of us instead. I was talking to my daughter," he said, "about what it might mean to have someone in our lives. Really in our lives. And she asked me why I was so worried about things not working out, why I wasn't thinking about what might happen if things did work out." She smiled. "Smart kid. The smartest." He reached out slowly and took her hand the same way he had that night in the office when everything started. "I don't want to take another break. I don't want to keep pretending I don't miss you. These 3 weeks have been the worst 3 weeks I've had in years." "Same," she whispered. "So what do we do?" She stepped closer until there was barely any space between them. "We try again. For real this time. No more running when things get hard." He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "Okay, let's try again." They did things differently this time. No more hiding. No more pretending. They went to their boss the very next day and told him about their relationship. Just laid it out honestly. They were seeing each other. They wanted to do things the right way, and they hoped it wouldn't be a problem. Their boss had looked at them for a long moment, then smiled. "I was wondering when you two would figure it out. Half the office has been taking bets for months." She'd felt her face go red. "Everyone knew?" "Not everyone, but enough people. You're not as subtle as you think." He'd leaned back in his chair. "Look, I appreciate you telling me. Just keep things professional here at work. No drama, can you do that?" They'd both nodded quickly, then we're good. Now get back to work. It had been that simple. All that stress, all that worry, and it took 5 minutes. She'd laughed about it later, how they'd built it up in their heads to be this huge thing when really, people were happy for them. Well, most people. There were a few awkward conversations. A couple of co-workers made comments, but nothing they couldn't handle. Nothing that mattered compared to what they were building. The next step was harder. Telling his ex-wife officially, not letting her find out through their daughter, but sitting down and having an adult conversation about it. It didn't go well at first. She was angry, defensive, made accusations about him moving on too fast, about putting their daughter in an unstable situation. They had a few tense phone calls where voices got raised and old wounds got reopened. But slowly, over weeks of difficult conversations, things settled. His ex-wife agreed to meet her just briefly at a custody exchange. It was awkward and uncomfortable, but they were civil. And more importantly, they both made it clear that their daughter's well-being came first. That was something they could agree on. Her own family took more convincing. Her mother was protective, skeptical, kept asking questions. "Are you sure about this? What about his daughter? What if it doesn't work out? What if you get hurt again?" But she stood her ground. "Mom, I love you. But this is my decision. Yes, it's complicated. Yes, there's risk. But I'd rather try and fail than spend my life wondering what might have been." Eventually, her mother came around. Invited them both to dinner. It was stiff at first, lots of polite small talk. But by dessert, her mother was laughing at one of his stories, and she could see the worry lines around her mother's eyes start to relax. The real test came in the everyday moments. The normal, boring, beautiful reality of building a life together. Movie nights at her apartment became a regular thing. His daughter would come over and they'd make popcorn and argue about what to watch. The little girl always lobbied for dinosaur documentaries. They'd compromise with animated movies that had at least one dinosaur character. One night, about 2 months in, the girl fell asleep halfway through the movie. Her head on his lap, her feet stretched across to rest on her leg. She'd looked down at this sleeping child, peaceful and trusting, and felt her heart swell with something she couldn't quite name. Not quite love yet, but the beginning of it. The foundation. He'd caught her looking and smiled, reached over and squeezed her hand. No words needed. There were small victories. The first time his daughter asked if she could come over next weekend. The first time she had a toothbrush at his apartment and he had one at hers. The first time they had a disagreement and actually talked it through instead of shutting down or walking away. That disagreement was about her job, actually. She'd been offered a position with another firm. Better pay, more responsibility, but it would mean more travel. She'd be gone 2, sometimes 3 weeks a month. You should take it, he'd said when she told him. But what about us? What about your daughter? I just became part of your lives. And you still will be. We'll figure it out. I'm not going to be the reason you don't follow your dreams. But she could see the worry in his eyes. The fear that distance might pull them apart. She had the same fear. They'd talked for hours, laid out the logistics, the reality. She'd eventually turned down the job, but not because he asked her to. Because she realized she didn't want it. Not right now. Not when she was building something here that mattered more than a title or a salary bump. Are you sure? He'd asked. I don't want you to resent me later. I'm sure. And I won't resent you. This is my choice. Maybe in a few years, if something similar comes up, I'll take it, and we'll figure that out then. But right now, I choose this. I choose us. Sunday mornings became her favorite time. She'd wake up in his apartment, the morning light filtering through the curtains. She'd hear him in the kitchen making coffee, humming quietly to himself. His daughter would pad out of her room in her dinosaur pajamas, still half asleep, climbing onto the couch to watch cartoons. These quiet, ordinary moments felt like peace. Like home. There were hard days, too. Days when his ex-wife was difficult and made custody exchanges tense. Days when she felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of being in a child's life. Days when they were both tired and stressed and snapped at each other over something small. But they'd learned to work through it. To say sorry. To talk instead of shutting down. To remember why they'd chosen this in the first place. 6 months in, they were back at the office late again. Working on another project, another deadline. It was almost like that first night, except everything was different now. She rolled her chair over to look at his screen, just like she had all those months ago. But this time there was no tension, no unspoken words, no careful distance. He reached out without thinking naturally and laced his fingers through hers. Kept working with his other hand, clicking through the design, explaining something about the structure. She watched him talk, watched the way his eyes lit up when he was excited about an idea, and felt this wave of gratitude for his courage in finally being honest that night, for her own courage in asking the question that changed everything. What are you smiling about? He asked, noticing her expression. Just thinking about how different this is from last time we stayed late together. He squeezed her hand. Better different or worse different? Definitely better. Good, because I was terrified that night. When you moved your chair closer and asked me to say what I was thinking. I thought my heart was going to explode. I was terrified too. Almost didn't say anything. I'm glad you did. Me too. They sat like that for a moment, hands joined, comfortable in the silence. Not the heavy, loaded silence from before. Just the easy quiet of two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. His daughter had a dinosaur-themed birthday party coming up next month. She was helping plan it, researching ideas, making lists of games and decorations. It felt natural now being part of these plans, being part of this family. Her apartment lease was coming up for renewal. They hadn't talked about it directly yet, but she knew the conversation was coming. About maybe finding a place together. Taking that next step, it scared her a little. But it excited her more, because that was the thing about love, real love. It wasn't about the big dramatic moments or the perfect timing. It was about choosing someone every day, through the complications and the messy reality and the normal, boring, beautiful everyday life. It was about sitting close enough to hold hands while working on a project, about Sunday morning cartoons and dinosaur facts, about difficult conversations and compromises and growing together instead of apart. It was about finally saying what you're thinking and finding out the other person was thinking the same thing all along. She looked at their joined hands, then back at the computer screen. We should probably actually finish this project, he laughed. Probably. But first, thank you. For what? For sitting closer. For asking the question. For giving us a chance. She leaned over and kissed his cheek. Thank you for answering. Outside, the city hummed with its nighttime energy. Inside, in this quiet office with just the glow of computer screens, two people who'd found each other continued building something real. Something complicated and imperfect and absolutely worth it. Not an ending, just a beginning that had finally bravely honestly started.